My name is Jim Green. At the time of the Alberton incident, I was the administrator of Disaster and Emergency Services in Helena. And prior to that, I worked 20-some years for state forestry, primarily in fire control. We want to kind of set the stage a little bit, but first, Tim, why don't you tell them what your job was then?
Tim Murphy, at the time I was the Chief of Fire and Aviation for DNRC, and I was DNRC's rep on the State Emergency Response Commission. Also at the time I was qualified as an area commander.
Okay. Prior to the Alberton train derailment, there were some other things happening in Montana. We already had the Freeman standoff going on in eastern Montana, started in March, and part of the CAT team was deployed to that, helping, they were running one of the state fire kitchens there to feed the FBI law enforcement. So part of the CAT team was deployed on that. A week before the train derailment, the Unabomber was arrested just out of Helena. And as we were approaching April 19th, there were a lot of law enforcement concerns because of the Freeman operation ongoing, a little bit with the Unabomber, but we're approaching the one-year anniversary of the Oklahoma City bombing and Hitler's birthday on the 19th. The night of April 11th, when this train, or the morning of April 11th, when the train derailment happened, there was another train derailment that same night further west at Knoxville. So there was a lot of speculation that there was terrorism involved. So that kind of got people's attention going. We also had flooding in 12 western Montana counties, including Missoula County and further west and north. And we had a state and federal disaster declaration. FEMA was on the ground helping the state gear up to process the claims on that. We had flooding in 5 northeastern counties in Montana up along the High Line. And we had a state declaration, and we were applying for a federal declaration. FEMA was involved with us on that. On the 15th of April, 4 days later, we had another train derailment up on the High Line near called Dotson, and it also involved a chlorine car. So there was no rupture. But it closed US Highway 2, and it closed the northern rail line. So the northern line's closed, the southern line is closed. Main east-west for northern tier of the United States, and impacting Canada also. And then 2 major highways closed. So as a result of that, and approaching April 19th, ourselves working with state law enforcement, approval of the governor, many state agencies and some federal agencies, we set up an area command in Helena to manage state and federal scarce resources in case some new incidents occurred. And that could have impacted Alberton if Alberton wasn't still at the top priority, if something else happened. In the State Emergency Operations Center, geared up the morning of April 11th immediately, and the big issue that we had was the health issues. The State Health Department, State Epidemiologist Todd Damrow came to the EOC, and we started getting calls from like the hospital in Butte. We have someone here who says they've been gassed with chlorine. What's going on? So we had to contact all the hospitals in the Pacific Northwest, including at least 2 Canadian provinces, Alberta and British Columbia. We had people stopping in Miles City saying that they had been affected that far away. And so it took quite a bit of effort to get the information out. Plus the medical community in these hospitals had never had to deal with chlorine gas. So we had to get technical experts on it to talk to the doctors in those communities. There were like 300 people that ended up getting medical treatment. And I think even on the 17th, there were still 5 in the hospital, 1 critically. And not just in Missoula Hospital, there were some other hospitals. Um, Outside of this area, the state had to deal with a lot of rumor control. The state offices were receiving calls that there were many dead animals due to the chlorine, that the river had turned green from the chlorine. There were fish dying in all the ponds. And then more questions about terrorism. Conflicting health impacts of chlorine because of lack of experience with it. Airspace closure over the Alberton area. The National Guard was activated to help do road closures after the first day to relieve the highway department and local law enforcement so they could go do their jobs. As the detour was, I don't know, what was it, 120 miles or something, the detour? But none of the wide loads. So we had wide loads stuck on both sides of this area for over 17 days, and it amounted to hundreds of trucks. And then the international and national issues with the transportation system having such an impact here in the state. The first morning, and reflected in the first IAP at the State Emergency Operations Center, there was a governor's emergency declaration which allowed state agencies to assist as requested outside their normal authorities, particularly like Tim's office, Department of Natural Resources. It didn't affect the federal agencies like the U.S. Forest Service. It was still, they just have to be kind of a good neighbor if we're going to get help from them. Those sorts of things. But one of the big issues is that the state supported local government's desire to remain in control and not have it taken over by the federal government. Tim will talk quite a bit more about that here in a minute. It took a lot of time, even as the incident went on into weeks, is trying to figure out what the long-term effect was going to be on people from the chlorine, on animals, both livestock and pets, and on vegetation. There's a lot of conflicting information that had to be worked out. So, with that, I'll turn it over to Tim, and he's got some additional information for you. Also up here we have 3 lists you can take a look at. We have the list of state agencies, federal agencies, and other agencies that were involved directly or indirectly.
So everybody should have in front of them their journal opened up to stand 5. Take a minute and just review quickly those 3 bullet items on that page. Okay, so before you write responses to those or discuss those as a team, let's talk about a few other things. It's now 2015, so you got to fast forward this incident 20 years. And what significant things are different now than they were 20 years ago? And what I mean by that is you got 9/11, you got Homeland Security. In other words, you probably have a little different posturing now than you did 20 years ago. And you got all this fun stuff called social media, tweeting and blogging and Facebook and all that kind of fun stuff, where 20 years ago, you really didn't have to worry about that. So as you go through these 3 bullets, again, put yourself as responding to this type of an incident or something similar in today's world. We all got a boss. Every team or every incident commander has a boss. And very seldom are you working for your normal daytime boss when you're an incident commander. You're normally removed from your normal day job. So in this situation, who's your agency administrators? Who's your line officers? Or who's your bosses? And I think from now you should have a fairly good idea who was in charge of the team on this incident. Related to that is how How I got tied into it is the governor, as Jim said, the next morning declared this a state of emergency. Jim called me, and with my hat on in the State Emergency Response Commission, Jim and the governor wanted me to be that focal point. And so within a few minutes, I got a call from the governor. The governor had one objective: don't let the feds take this over. So that's pretty simple. The next morning, Dan Watts, who was in the Unified IC with Scott, Paul Lacey, who was the plans chief on the local team, and myself went down to MRL's headquarters, Washington Corporation's headquarters, and we gave a briefing to Governor Roscoe and Dennis Washington, who was the president of Washington Corporation. After that briefing, the governor and Dennis asked us to excuse ourselves and go out and sit in the foyer, have a cup of coffee, and then call us back in. So in less than 10 minutes, we were called back in. And we were told by Dennis Washington that Washington Corp was going to pay for this big bad deal. And we were told by the governor again, don't let the feds take this over. So about the same time, EPA from Denver showed up with the West Coast strike team of the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard, the Clark Fork River is a navigable river, so they've got a stake in that, they've got legal authority in that. But the Coast Guard is also the entity that EPA uses as their technical ICS experts. So the Coast Guard fell underneath his arm. He had the Code of Federal Register, and he pulled that out, and he showed everybody that when you got a hazmat deal, EPA can take it over. And oh, by the way, EPA wanted to take this over. And then the lady from the Coast Guard, she had underneath her arm an FPA 472 that said, oh, by the way, you got to run this thing under this thing called ICS, and it's got to be run by type 1 qualified individuals per NFPA 472. So those, I guess, are a few little inputs. So who's your bosses? You got a charge from the governor. You've got a checkbook from Dennis Washington, and you've got the EPA on the ground with the U.S. Coast Guard. So as you answer these questions, bear that in mind. One other thing, as Jim mentioned, is you got a state delegation of authority, but there's no tie into FEMA or no tie into the state or local government accessing federal resources. In other words, the Forest Service or this fire cache with lots of stuff in it. So that's another issue. So go ahead and spend a few minutes in your journal and deal with those 3 points as if it was 2015. And then at the end here, if we'll answer any questions after you spend some time on your journal.
When the feds show up, I mean, what other politics were played? Did the governor call in Caucus and everybody else, hey, go call the Coast Guard off?
Well, yeah,
I mean, that must have been pretty interesting.
The governor was well connected in the Bush administration to a large degree. But then on the CERC, the co-chair of the CERC, DEQ, they have some direct pipelines with EPA, and they have some of their authority, so we had some help negotiating there. But the governor personally knew Dennis Washington, and I'm sure it was a joint decision, because then Washington Corporation would lose all control of costs.
Yeah, the Coast Guard strike team was very forceful that they were the experts in ICS. And
we even pulled out cards and compared qualifications, and in Montana we had much higher ones than they did. But the issue in that was these coaches that we brought into, and the coach is a true word that we brought in to help coach the locals that may or may not be qualified at the type 1 level. So that pretty much diffused the Coast Guard's issue, is once we showed the Coast Guard that we had more than qualified type 1 people helping on the incident. The individual from EPA who really couldn't speak very good English, which was a challenge,
It finally got to the point on day 2 that we went back to the governor and said, you got to get rid of this guy. And so magically, by the next morning, he was gone. And we had a much more user-friendly person from the EPA that wanted to help where it was needed, but was also, you know, if I don't feel comfortable, locals, that you're managing this, I can't take it over. But as long as you're doing okay in my eyes, I'm here to help you. I'll get whatever help we needed, and that worked out great. Matter of fact, Scott and him became personal good friends and went fishing together. So.
And one thing, I don't know if it came up for your group or not at the last stand, is it's not like the EPA just was pushed out of the scene. They've got an on-scene coordinator who's running things out there at the train cars. The EPA is still directly and heavily involved. They're just not running the show.
And all of these all-hazard incidents that are truly all-hazard like this, you're going to have intertwined responsibilities. And I guess that's the way to think of it. There's multiple responsibilities. How you handle that through unified command or however you do it, each situation is going to be different.
So the Coast Guard and EPA, were they part of your unified command team, or did they go to operational issues?
They went to operational issues, and they worked directly with the liaison officer to make sure, here's what we need, EPA, can you find us this type of help, or you happy with what's going on?
So they had some operational responsibilities under the unified.
That's right, yeah. But when the second person from EPA came, he said, yeah, I don't want that box that says IC, but here's what I want, and here's what I can do for you, which was much more user-friendly.
Well, one of the things to really consider as a team, that anything that's starting to grow, you need a liaison officer for all those agency reps to report to, so that the ops chief and the IC aren't overwhelmed.
Yeah, the first fellow from EPA, all he wanted to do on the organization chart at the board out there at Frenchtown Fire is he wanted to be in the box above the IC box, and he kept trying to poke his fingers through the whiteboard.
So we got about 3-4 minutes left for.
But just to be clear, it was the governor that kind of took care of a lot of that issue.
Well, the governor did, particularly with the Washington Corporation, and where they stepped up and said, yeah, we're responsible to pay for this. That took a lot of the issues. If they had not, then we might have had to use EPA to get them to pay for a lot of things.
And then it was the comparison of the ultimate qualifications that probably did it.
Well, I don't know how big of a role that played, but at least the local Coast Guard people, they couldn't squawk about it.
That's right.
Yeah.
And just think what went on in that 5-minute conversation between Dennis Washington and the governor. Talk about leadership. I mean, they sorted that out pretty quick.
Yeah. And unfortunately, we had the governor that we did, because the governor knew his role. You know, he was in charge of the state resources, but he wasn't in charge of making the decision on the ground at Alberton. He knew that.
What was the state's final cost?
I don't know offhand, but I would, like DNRC.
Oh, you mean, what did MRL not pay?
Well, I was curious.
$35,000.
Cool.
At the end, MRL paid all costs for this incident other than $35,000.
That's never any good.
That's excellent.
That's,
Yeah.
Yeah, and MRL's own costs, which we will probably never know for their environmental contractors, had to be enormous.
And if we'd gone through FEMA that way, even though it's hard to get a federal declaration for emergency response for them to kick in money, even if we had, we wouldn't have gotten near that kind of reimbursement, and the accounting would have been much more difficult for local government.
There's a letter, if you really want to know, go back to the preliminary reading thing. There was a link to a letter from Janet Ellis.
Yeah, I read that. I read that one.
That was the final financial closeout issues. They paid pretty much the whole thing.
This incident, the CERC used it as kind of a catalyst for creation of what we now have in Montana, the existing regional hazmat teams. I mean, it took a number of years and didn't come to fruition until after 9/11 with those money. But that was a catalyst because of what occurred in this incident.
You're okay for now, the other group's not out there, so if there's any
Oh,
questions or discussion you want.
So who's the incident commander's boss, or bosses?
Oh, not really. Depends, I guess, on you.
Well, this one.
Now, it should have been his board of trustees or whoever signed the delegation authority. But from what he said, that was kind of not necessarily the case because the county.
Yeah. But he did, Scott told us, I think yesterday, that he did talk to his board and they were okay with it, but it was never formalized. On your team, that if you're dealing with another, doesn't matter even if it's a wildfire and you've got a city or county involved, you want the delegation of authority or a unified command, one way or the other, to do that. And then all hazard, it just becomes so much more complicated. What are some of the tools in ICS that you have when you get in these very complicated situations? What are some of the principles of ICS as a tool that you can use?
Liaison officers.
The liaison officers is one of the key ones. What are some of the other ones?
You get deputies from different agencies.
Deputies, that's excellent, yes.
What would you say, deputy?
Yeah, like you have one ops chief from one.
Agency administrators can help you, and they need to agree upon your team's objectives if you're putting in that IAP.
Span of control.
The span of control. This, if you don't manage that right away, you're going to lose. You know, there were 40 to 50 agencies in some of those public meetings during this thing.
I think keeping, I was gonna ask you how often you brief the governor's office, like they run a set cycle at once a.
Oh, the governor's office, at the minimum, got 2 written reports a day, plus they were getting phone calls from me, probably from Tim. The governor's chief of staff was active with you, but we had access to the governor anytime we needed, 24 hours a day.
He was on the site a couple of times.
Yeah, he came and visited a couple times. But the governor, most governors they don't want to go to the incident right away because they don't want to slow down the operations until things stabilize.
Right, it's just, I think you can decide to be proactive about briefing the agency
That's right.
administrators, or you can wait until they're bugging you, so once you get proactive about it.
No, we didn't have any issues with the governor's office. Everybody worked. Part of our difficult is probably initially some of Tim's bosses at DNRC said, that's outside of authority. You can go do that for a little half a day or a day till it's finished. But they never anticipated it going on this long. And then, of course, Tim knew that the Forest Service had all these goodies over here. And that was hard to tap into.
Luckily, it took a week for the Forest Service at Washington DC to figure out all their people and goodies were gone.
Okay, so the other group's here.
Okay.